Hi, welcome to Amanda's Book Corner. I'm Amanda, and this is my January wrap-up video. So I read a total of 8 books in January. I thought it'd be more, but I was kind of a little bit slow at certain points. But anyway, I read 8 books in January, including 2 audiobooks, and 5 of the books I read were translations, which was part of my January reading challenge theme, which was to read books in translation. So I'll talk a little bit about each of the 8 books I read this month, but if you want a deeper discussion into the plot and my thoughts about each book, I'll also link to each of their full-length review videos. The first book I read is The Siren of Sussex by Mimi Matthews. This is the first book in her Bells of London series, and I absolutely love this book. This book is set in England in 1862, and it follows a young woman who is a gentleman's daughter, not titled, but she has some money, although her finances are dwindling. Her name is Evelyn Maltravers, and she's having her first season in London, and she's really determined to make sure that she secures a husband so that her younger sisters can also have good seasons in the future. She ends up working with an up-and-coming tailor named Ahmad Malik. He's half Indian, half British, and they end up having a certain romance with each other, but it's a little bit forbidden because they come from different classes, they come from different races, and this is the 1860s, and so it's really hard to envision a relationship between these two when they have these external differences between them. This is a really cute story. I really loved it. It offers a lot of the things I love most in books. It features horses, and I love horses. I always did ever since I was a kid. It features some interesting discussions of race and of class and of colonialism, which I thought was really well done in this book. It's funny and it's sweet and it's smart, and I really love the romance that slowly develops between Evelyn and Ahmed. So this was a 5-star read for me. I adored this book, and I cannot wait for the second book. The second book is called The Belle of Belgrave Square, and it comes out in October, and I cannot wait to read that one. The second book I read is The Wedding Setup by Sonali Dev, and that one is a short story. It's a romance, but it's definitely a more emotional romance that has to do with grief and of kind of losing a sense of your identity in the aftermath of losing someone that you love. It's a second chances romance that follows an Indian American woman whose mother is kind of tired of her being single, not being married, not having kids, and so her mom tries to set her up with some random guy who's a gynecologist, and she's not interested in that. But while she goes to the wedding where she's supposed to meet up with this guy, she ends up reconnecting with a man that she used to date and hasn't seen in several years. What follows is a very emotional reckoning with who she is now versus who she used to be, and coming to terms with whether she can pursue her own interests, her own passions, her own love and partner, versus what her mom wants of her. So I was surprised at how emotional this one was. And it packs a lot in, even though it is a short story. It's only about 67 pages, I think. So it packs a lot of punch for being such a short story. But I ended up really loving this one, and I gave it 4 stars. The next book I read is the Travel Cat Chronicles by Hiro Arikawa. This one was the first translation book that I read for January, with my reading challenge theme of reading books in translation. And it's translated from Japanese, and I really loved this one too. It follows a cat and the owner that he has, and his owner can no longer keep this cat for some mysterious reason, so he's trying to find a new home for the cat. He ends up taking the cat, Nana, to different friends that he had throughout his childhood to see if any of them would be a good fit and a good home for his cat. So half of the book is told from the perspective of Nana, and he's such a snarky and fun little narrator. I really need to read more books that are narrated by a cat because they're pure gold. But in this book, we also get some third-person narrative about his owner and the friends that he had in his childhood, and over the course of a few chapters you start to get a picture painted of this guy and why he's such a good person and how he's such a good friend despite the traumas that he's had in his own life. This book ended up being really emotional, and I will admit I did cry, so don't go into this if you want a happy, light, fluffy, fun read, because it definitely does get emotional, but it really speaks to that deep bond between a human and their pet, specifically a cat, and the kind of love that they share. As a cat owner myself, I really did love this book, and I ended up giving it 5 stars. Next up, I read a book called The Fugitives by Jamal Majoub. This one was wonderful. I absolutely love this one. So this one starts off in Sudan, and it follows a jazz band that is reforming after a surprise invitation to go to Washington, D.C. and perform at a special event. This band has been disbanded for decades now, and indeed some of the members have passed away at this point. The remaining members are pretty old. But the son of one of the founding members decides to get the group back together, and they end up pulling through to get themselves to America and play that festival. But then things do start to go in a very different direction. So one thing I loved about this book is how musical it is. I really love getting to know this jazz band and learning what Sudanese music is like. I admit I don't know much about African music, and specifically not Sudanese music for sure, but I really love getting to hear about the different influences on their music and hearing about this band and the instrumentalists in it. I enjoyed that aspect so much. I also really loved the political themes that came up in it. So one thing is this book is set in the 2010s during Trump's administration, and as you might recall, he had a Muslim ban. And further, Sudan was on that list of banned countries. So we get to see the Sudanese band, these Sudanese people in America during this time, and the kind of conflicts that they face while they're there in terms of immigration and refugees. And it offers some interesting discussion that I think is really important right now. It's also a very fun and kind of quirky book. Like I said, it goes into some different directions once they're in America that were surprising for me. But it turns into a fun adventure, and an adventure that involves other things, like helping older people feel alive again, feel young again. So I really love this book, and I loved how everything came together in the end. So this is a book that I gave 5 stars. The 5th book I read is Life Begins on Friday by Ioana Parvulescu. So I got this book as a gift from my sister. She got it in Romania, and indeed this book is by a Romanian author, and it's translated from Romanian. So again, this is a book that would fit for my translation theme. This book is a little bit harder to describe. It's definitely a quirkier book and probably the weirdest one that I read this month, but I actually ended up really liking it. It's set in Bucharest in 1897, and it follows a collection of different characters in the last 13 days of the year. So it's set right around Christmas and the New Year, so it worked for a holiday read if you want to count it as that. It kind of starts when this guy, Dan Crețu, ends up in Bucharest, and no one can figure out where he's from. In fact, he's actually fallen through time. He's from the future, and he doesn't know how he ended up in 1897, but he also doesn't have any clear memories of his life before and who he really is. So there's a little bit of a mystery there. But in addition to the mystery, we also get to know these other characters and a kind of maybe romance between this young woman and this guy that she knows. And we also follow this little kid who is poor, but he works. And this book weaves together a lot of different themes. And it's definitely a weirder book, though, I will say. It was fun to read, but I was often kind of confused about what was happening and what the point of it all was going to be and how it all come together in the end. It is quirky, and at the end there is a note from an author saying that this book is even weird for Romanians, so it's not just a translation thing, it's actually a quirky little book. But it was definitely interesting, and I really enjoyed reading it. It definitely kept me engaged, although I think it could have been a little bit better if there had been fewer characters, just because it was kind of a lot to juggle, especially when certain characters were more interesting than others. But even so, I enjoyed reading this book, and I gave it 3.5 stars. Next up was At Night, All Blood is Black by David Diop. Now this is a book that came out a little bit over a year ago, and it's another translated from French, and the author is Senegalese French. This is a really interesting book. So it's set during World War I, and it follows a Senegalese man who's fighting on behalf of the French in World War I. At the very beginning, his best friend, his more than brother, dies in front of him, and he feels really guilty about letting his friend die in such a miserable way. And it really traumatizes him to the point that he becomes kind of a murderer. I mean, it's war, so he's meant to kill his enemies, but each night he kills one man and cuts off the right hand and brings that right hand home as a sort of trophy. The whole book is told from his perspective, and it's probably the most immersive book that I've ever read. It's so immersive that you don't really feel tethered to a certain time or space. It's kind of hard to situate yourself in the setting of the book. You're really so much in this character's mind and the kind of madness that seems to be growing in him that everything else kind of falls away. As the book moves forward, you start to get some more background on this character, his life growing up in Senegal, his relationship with his friend that died, the different kinds of guilt that he has about his relationship or friendship with this guy and why he let him die. It's definitely fascinating, and it's very poetic and lyrical the way it's written. Also, the way this narrator speaks is very repetitive, but in a way that makes sense and kind of builds up his character. He often says the phrase, "I know," "I understand," and he also says God's truth before saying things. And so, on the one hand, they can be very repetitive because he says them multiple times throughout the book, throughout each chapter really, but it also really puts you in his mind and keeps you in his mind in a really wonderful way. So this book is very cerebral and very emotional, and it's kind of dark, but it's very fascinating. So I ended up giving this one 5 stars. The last novel that I read is The Bad Girl by Mario Vargas Llosa. So I say it all the time, my husband is Peruvian, and he's the one that encouraged me to read this book. Mario Vargas Llosa is a Nobel Prize winning author from Peru, and so this is a book that my husband recommended to me. He assured me that I would love it, and I did. This book starts off in 1950, and it follows a man named Ricardo, and how he meets this girl. Her name is Lily, and he falls in love with her one summer when he's turning 15. She tells him that she's from Chile, but at the end of the first chapter we find out that she's not from Chile. And from there, it fast forwards a decade. Now they're in their 20s, and they're in Paris, and we follow as Ricardo and the bad girl, whose name we keep not really knowing because she keeps changing her name. But we follow as Ricardo and the bad girl keep meeting up and coming together, but then being torn apart, usually by the bad girl herself. And this kind of tumultuous relationship they have with each other, and the way that she mistreats him, and the way that she lies, and the way she's trying to climb her way up, mostly for wealth, but also for a sense of security and even a little bit of power. This book takes us from Peru to France to England to Japan. We spend a little bit of time in Spain and a little bit of time in Egypt. It's a fascinating book, and although it's definitely quirky and light in certain ways, it also has a lot of depth to it, and it gets pretty emotional and sad later on as certain traumas and horrible things start happening. But although it has this kind of darkness and this kind of emotional depth to it, it still retains a certain type of levity that keeps it engaging and keeps you going through the pages really fast. It's a quick read and a very engaging read. I also like how intellectual it is. You can tell that the narrator, or the author rather, is very well read. He knows about the arts, he knows about politics. So there's a lot in here that really bolsters the book without making it too pretentious or too intellectual. I also love how he describes different locations. He describes Lima beautifully, and I lived in Lima, so it transported me back to a time when I lived there. He also describes Paris really well. That's not a place I have been to yet, but he describes it and makes you feel like you are there, even if you've never been there before. So this book is really well done. It transports you across different continents, but it also transports you across decades from 1950 into the 1980s. This book is at times heartbreaking, but it's also really beautiful and really fun, and it offers great examination of these two characters and how they're so different, and why the bad girl is so bad, but why she also has complexities to her as well, and why Ricardo is so good, but how he also has different layers to him. So I thought this was an excellent book. It was my first foray into Mario Vargas Llosa, but I'll definitely be reading more from him. So I gave this book 5 stars. The last book I read is a collection of short stories called The City of Mist by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. Unfortunately, he passed away in June 2020, and this is his last book published posthumously. So if you've read his Cemetery of Forgotten Books series, a lot of the characters and themes that you see in those books do appear in some of these short stories. Not all of them, but several character names will definitely be familiar to you. You'll also recognize the actual Cemetery of Forgotten Books and get a little bit of an insight into its origins. He also has some stories about real people, including Miguel de Cervantes, the author of Don Quixote, and Gaudí, the architect that is famous for his really interesting buildings and structures that he built in Barcelona. So this book really stays true to the kinds of vibes that you're probably used to if you've read anything from Carlos Ruiz Zafón. It's set in Barcelona primarily. It's very foggy and dreamy, a little bit nightmarish. It's usually set in the wintertime, so you have gray clouds and the rain, and it's kind of cold. And this really fits the types of stories that he tells that are often haunting in certain ways. They're often about grief and about madness, and they're often pretty sad, I will say, but they also have this certain vibe that is just really transfixing. It's a pretty short book, only about 150 pages, and it has 11 different short stories. Some of them are quite short, only a couple pages, and some are longer, about 40 pages. But it was a fun and quick read, and it definitely has the right vibes for like the winter time or when you're in a spooky mood. So if you've read his previous books, this is definitely one that fits with those vibes. But if you haven't read his books, it's still one that is fun and easy to get into. So I did enjoy this book, and I gave it 4.5 stars. So January was a great month for books. I enjoyed pretty much everything I read, and I read 5 translations as I mentioned, including these 3 and the 2 audiobooks that I mentioned. I read books that are translated from Japanese, Spanish, French, and Romanian. And again, if any of those books sounded interesting to you, please check out my full reviews of each book. Each book has a 5 to 10 minute full-length review that I've put up on my YouTube channel, so you can watch those for more insights and deeper discussions. So I hope you enjoyed this wrap-up video. If you did, please like, comment, and subscribe. And to make sure you don't miss any more of my videos, please ring the bell to get all my notifications. I put out about 1 to 2 videos like this one every week, as well as 2 to 3 book review videos every week. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye!